How we doing, folks? Dave Brown back here with the new Populist. Thank you for joining me again. These last few days, we've had these confirmation hearings that have been somewhat of a clown show, especially the Pete Hegseth confirmation hearing. The Democrats are apparently obsessed with his past sexual behavior and history, and not so much with his vision of how he wants to run the Pentagon. So thank you, Democrats, for making this process more annoying than it has to be. And generally, I'll be honest, I'm not that interested in these confirmation hearings. But there is one person who did have a hearing that I did find interesting and find what he had to say noteworthy. And that is the hearing for Marco Rubio, Trump's pick for Secretary of State. And of course, as Secretary of State, he will be our top diplomat and advancing U.S. foreign policy. So what he had to say, I found to be interesting, and I think is worth breaking down. So here's about a 5-minute clip of Marco Rubio during his hearing yesterday. I think it was yesterday. Keep in mind, there were some interruptions by protesters, so I made a couple of cuts to work around those interruptions. So if you see that, that's why they're there. So here's Marco Rubio talking about his vision for the State Department and the United States moving forward.
At the end of the Second World War, the United States was, in the words of then Secretary of State, tasked with creating an order, a world order, a free half, as he quote in his quote, out of chaos, without blowing to pieces, without blowing the whole of the world into pieces in the process. And in the decades that followed, that global order served us quite well. Americans' incomes rose and communities flourished. Alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and Europe that led to the emergence of stability and democracy and prosperity in these regions. All right, alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe that led to the emergence of stability, democracy, and prosperity, but it also prevented a cataclysmic world war. And ultimately, a wall in Berlin came down, and with it, an evil empire. Out of the triumphalism of the end of the long Cold War emerged a bipartisan consensus. And this consensus was that we had reached the end of history, that all of the nations of the world would now become members of the democratic Western-led community, that a foreign policy that served the national interest could now be replaced by one that served the liberal world order, and that all mankind was now destined to abandon national sovereignty and national identity, and would instead become one human family and citizens of the world. This wasn't just a fantasy. We now know it was a dangerous delusion.
So he's talking about 1991, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the, as he calls it, the death of an evil empire. And I point out, and just recently in my other recent videos, that yes, the Cold War came to an end and the Soviet Union was dissolved, but Russia still existed, and Russia was weak, but they were going to rebound at some point, which they did, and which has led to our current situation with Ukraine and Russia now. So the Cold War, officially ended, but in reality, it never really did. But yes, in 1991, we were the sole superpower, and we thought at that point we could basically project on the entire world our vision and that everyone would just follow along. And that wasn't the case. There were other countries who didn't want to be part of this vision, China for one, and now we know Russia. But we were the strongest country, and we started to sort of bully the rest of the world. We expanded NATO. We started the Middle East wars in 91 and then 2003. And we just sort of expected everybody to follow along. And that was stupid because you can't force other countries to adopt your vision of the world. And now we're in a situation in 2025 where we're essentially having 3 different superpowers, China, Russia, and the United States. So our unipolar moment of being the sole superpower only lasted about 30 years. And we're back to this almost like this Cold War situation where we have these hostilities borderline on war with great powers. So yes, this idea of globalization and that we're all going to be one community, and that national sovereignty wasn't particularly important, that was stupid and has backfired big time. So he's right about that. So I'm glad to hear Marco Rubio say no to globalization.
Here in America and in many of the advanced economies across the world, an almost religious commitment to free and unfettered trade at the expense of our national economy shrunk the middle class, left the working class in crisis, collapsed our industrial capacity, and has pushed critical supply chains into the hands of adversaries and of rivals.
Now, the free trade is a big issue for a lot of Republicans. Your traditional neocon, old school Republican are big free traders. And people like Ron Paul, who's a libertarian, is big on free trade. And although I admire Ron Paul greatly, free trade is one place where I disagree with him big time. As Rubio points out, free trade over the last 30 or 40 years, has it helped the middle class? And the evidence would say, no, it has not. It has hurt the middle class. And why is this? I pointed out in previous videos that when you have other states, other countries who are adversarial toward the United States, they're going to manipulate the situation for their benefit. For example, China suppresses the value of their currency in order to have more foreign investment and to export more goods. So in a free trade environment, other countries can again manipulate things and take advantage of it for their own benefit and to the lack of benefit to the United States. And when he talks about supply chain issues, the pandemic is a great example of how not having control of your supply chains can be a huge problem. Trump was making noise about the China virus, and China was not happy about that. And China manufactures a lot of our antibiotics. And they said to us, essentially, you keep on talking about us in this way, we're going to have a problem shipping you all these antibiotics, which will be, of course, a huge problem for the United States and would be devastating. So having adversarial countries like China have control of our supply chains and manufacture goods that are critical for us is a national security issue. So that's another reason why free trade is not good. It gives other countries control over us. So I'm not a free trader, and I agree with Marco Rubio and Donald Trump. Free trade, absolute free trade is harmful, and we should negotiate trade on a one-to-one basis with other countries based on that specific circumstance. So yes, free trade in general for everyone with no restrictions is stupid. And I think history has proven that to be the case.
An irrational zeal for maximum freedom of movement of people has resulted in a historic mass migration crisis here in America, but also around the world. It's one that threatens the stability of societies and of governments. Across the West, governments now censor and even prosecute domestic political opponents. Meanwhile, radical jihadists openly march in the streets and sadly drive vehicles into our people. While America far too often continued to prioritize the global order above our core national interests, other nations continued to act the way countries always have. So while America too often prioritized the global order above our core national interests, other nations continued to act the way nations have always acted and always will, in what they perceive to be their best interest. And instead of folding into the post-Cold War global order, they have manipulated it to serve their interests at the expense of ours.
Now, he points out the obvious. Countries act in their own interest. That's again, that should be obvious. And he's talking specifically, and you'll hear later about China, and he's going to put a lot of pressure on China, saying that they took advantage of us. And I say it's a two-way street. Yes, China does things with intellectual property. They have stolen stuff. They do manipulate trade, but we've gone along with it because it has made several corporations, a lot of freaking money. So we can criticize them for that, but we are culpable in allowing it and profiting from it as well.
We welcomed the Chinese Communist Party into the global order, and they took advantage of all of its benefits, and they ignored all of its obligations and responsibilities. Instead, they have repressed and lied and cheated and hacked and stolen their way into global superpower status, and they have done so at our expense and at the expense of the people of their own country.
And this is the comment I found to be troubling from Marco Rubio. Certainly, you can be critical of China, and I certainly am, but to act as if their entire ascension to status as a superpower came from, lying and cheating and theft, I think is a bit harsh and a bit antagonistic of the Chinese. And we sort of view China's rise in this zero-sum game that if they're doing better, that somehow hurts us. And that sort of thinking, I think, is dangerous and outdated. But unfortunately, Rubio is saying that, China being strong is harming us. And although he does add, it's also harming the people of China. But that's not really his concern. His concern is the United States.
In our very own hemisphere, narco-terrorists, and dictators, and despots take advantage of open borders to drive mass migration, to traffic in women and children, and to flood our communities with deadly fentanyl and violent criminals. In Moscow, in Tehran, in Pyongyang, dictators, rogue states now sow chaos and instability and align with and they fund radical terror groups. And then they hide behind their veto power at the United Nations Security Council or the threats of nuclear war. The post-war global order is not just obsolete. It is now a weapon being used against us. And all this has led to a moment in which we must now confront the single greatest risk of geopolitical instability and of generational global crisis in the lifetime of anyone alive and in this room today.
I find it interesting he accuses these other countries of taking advantage of the liberal world order that we created and have been trying to force on everybody else. Like, I kind of think that's a little ridiculous. Like, no, we created it for our benefit, but it was used against us to harm us. Not so much, Marco. And this is some of this, talking about dictators. I wish his language a little softer, but he is representing Trump, and we know Trump likes to be bellicose and tough and then negotiate from that point. But this also reflects old school, conservative, Reaganite sort of thinking, where the world is, good and bad. It's good versus evil. We're the good guys, and everybody else is terrible, and we have to, be in constant conflict with them. So, again, I wish he were a little softer, a little more diplomatic. But, not the case.
8 decades later, we are once again called to create a free world out of the chaos. And this will not be easy. And it will be impossible without a strong and a confident America that engages in the world, putting our core national interests once again above all else.
So he admits that, 8 decades ago, we had to rebuild the world and make it great. And then we got to do it again. And again, this is where I'm like, do we have to keep operating with this idea that it's our way or the highway? We have to control the entire world. The question has been asked, will the United States accept a multipolar world? And the more I hear Marco Rubio talk, the more I say, I don't think so. Our position is still, we're number one, and we need everybody else to fall into line. And again, that's old school thinking and not much of a change, although he is saying that globalism did fail and that we need to protect our own interests, which is good.
4 years ago, I believe we began to see the outlines and the beginnings of what that would look like. During President Trump's first term, American strength was a deterrent to our adversaries, and it gave us leverage in diplomacy. There were no new wars. ISIS was eviscerated. Soleimani was dead. The historic Abraham Accords were born, and Americans were safer as a result. Now, President Trump returns to office with an unmistakable mandate from the voters. They want a strong America, A strong America engaged in the world, but guided by a clear objective to promote peace abroad and security and prosperity here at home. That is the promise that President Trump was elected to keep. And if I am confirmed, keeping that promise will be the core mission of the United States Department of State.
So that's part of Marco Rubio's speech in front of the Senate, and some good things, some bad things. But if I had to sum up his position and what he's going to be doing in the next 4 years, it's basically this: globalism has failed. We are going to go back to America first and putting our interests first, which is good. But the bad thing is, it seems we're not accepting a multipolar world, and we're reviewing the entire world outside of Western Europe and the United States as being the bad guys who we have to use strength to sort of whip into shape. So some good stuff, some bad stuff, and ultimately we'll have to see over the next 4 years how this all unravels. Of course, the war in Ukraine will be a big challenge for Rubio and for Trump as well. And that's really the biggest thing on the plate right now. Can we resolve that war in Ukraine? Because if it gets worse, obviously our worry is things going out of control and having some sort of direct confrontation. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. And some people weren't a fan of the Rubio pick. I was sort of middle ground. He is smart, and I do think he is going to push Trump's agenda for the most part. So I'm not so worried of him undermining Trump. It looks like he's going to play ball, push the agenda. And I think he understands that MAGA is watching. If he becomes rogue and goes off on his own, he will be fired and his political career will be over. So I'm fairly confident that he will stay in line and work to help Trump, not to hurt him. So that's a good thing. Well, that's it for now. If you are new to my channel, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.